Continuing the trend of TSW4's core routes being massive letdowns, we now turn to the last route in the trio. This is my review of the East Coast Mainline Peterborough to Doncaster route, plus the overrated Flying Scotsman steam locomotive. I'm just going to cut to the chase. This is a terrible route choice, largely due to the incredibly boring nature of the Peterborough to Doncaster section, especially when compared to the London King's Cross to Peterborough section. The lack of any branches off the main line didn't help my first impressions of this route, whose only remotely interesting landmarks are Stoke Bank, site of the record-breaking run by A4 Pacific No. 4468 Mallard, as well as the flat diamond crossing just north of Newark Northgate. Not helping the situation is the fact that the Peterborough to Doncaster section already exists in TS Classic, as part of Creative Rail's York to Peterborough add-on. I haven't got it, but at least those guys actually bothered to put in the extra effort to model the section up to York. That was only an extra 27 miles north of Doncaster, which makes Dovetail's offering look even more pathetic. This may sound like a strange take, but this is my channel and I'm not afraid to speak my mind. I think it's insulting that DTG gave us the, in my opinion, wrong section of a highly requested line, rubbing salt in the wound by acknowledging the ECML as being highly requested in pre-release articles. I heard that it was apparently easier for them to make Peterborough to Doncaster, or DTG said it was the easiest section to make, something of that nature. But that just sounds like a sugar-coated way of Dovetail openly admitting their laziness. I would have thought that London King's Cross to Peterborough would have been the better choice. That way, you would have been able to A. add the Hertford loop to make the route less linear, and B. make better use of the Class 700, or better yet, finally add the 12-car 700/1 variant, whose absence bothers me to no end, as well as the Class 387/1 and 717 for Great Northern services. After all, we do already have a 387 in the game, although that's the 387/2. DTG would also need to add the Moorgate branch as well. I would be absolutely livid if they pulled a Sheerness with this one too, especially given the unusual nature and history of this branch. It didn't become part of the National Rail Network until 1976, prior to which it was operated as a branch of the London Underground Northern Line. At 79 miles long, this is the longest end-to-end UK route in TSW, but I don't judge whether or not a route is good based solely on its length. While you can race along at up to 125 miles per hour in the Class 801, this route is spoiled by its very boring and linear nature, not helped by the fact that it's only got 5 stations. And those stations are Peterborough, Grantham, Newark Northgate, Retford, and Doncaster. The problem with a route like Peterborough to Doncaster is that you will be spending most of your time racing through the countryside between stations, which will get boring because of how few stations there are. Fortunately, the longest distance between 2 stations in the UK is not on the ECML. Instead, it's the 47 miles from Lockerbie to Carstairs, over on the West Coast Mainline. Come to think of it, I wouldn't mind seeing Carlisle to Glasgow in TSW, provided that it included a good variety of trains and some of the suburban lines in Glasgow, complete with a roster like the Class 70 diesel and a Class 92 electric for freight, as well as the Class 318, 320 and 380 EMUs for commuter services, and the Class 390 Pendolino for intercity services. Or, instead of the 318, 320 and 380, you could just reuse the 314 from Cathcart Circle, as frustrating as that would be. Only one new train is included with this route, and that's the LNER Class 801. This is an electric-only variant of the controversial Hitachi IET family, and I'm rather annoyed that we don't even get the electro-diesel Class 800 alongside the 801, let alone the Hull Trains Class 802 and Lumo Class 803. The lack of the Class 91 and Mark IV coaches doesn't help the situation at all, but at least you get both the 5 and 9 car variants of the 801. You do not want to know how angry I would be if DTG left out either variant. When I went to explore the Class 801's interior, I found out that there's a kitchen in the first class driving coach, albeit a poorly detailed kitchen, which explains why there's 3 blanked out window spaces on each side. I'm not surprised that some IETs have this feature, especially since the electro-diesel Class 800 can be seen on services as long as London Paddington to Swansea and London King's Cross to Inverness. The Class 801 model in TSW4 is an admirable improvement on the outdated 801 model we've got in TS Classic, which was made back in 2014 before any of the real units had even been built. Although it does significantly improve the sounds, Armstrong Powerhouse's IET Enhancement Pack basically just put lipstick on a pig. Especially since they didn't bother altering the cab model or making a new one to accurately depict the differences between the different classes. The 801's cab, and indeed the whole train, looks like a more modern version of the Class 395 Javelin. The 801's horn and motor sounds are at least slightly accurate, although something sounds off with said motors, just like the ScotRail Class 385. But from what I can tell, Dovetail reused running sounds from the Class 377 Electrostar on the 801. Trust these people to be lazy with the sounds again. I mean seriously, did anyone think that people wouldn't notice this? Or do they just not care about the simple fact that Electrostars and IETs are completely different trains? That would be like reusing recordings of a Class 323's traction motors on a bloody London and South Western Railway C14 class. It's so wrong that you just don't do that sort of thing. Unfortunately, or rather unsurprisingly, we only get the standard LNER livery for the Class 801 without any special variations. In real life, unit number 801226 has been named Together and carries rainbow decals, in a similar manner to Class 395 number 395012. Meanwhile, 801228 is named Centenary to celebrate 100 years since the original London and North Eastern Railway was created. The current LNER train operating company has no historical connection to the original, which was in existence from 1923 to 1948. There are 2 glaring issues I've noticed with the Class 801, above all others, and I'll mention the second one a little later on. On AI services, you can clearly hear a bloody diesel engine roaring away, despite the fact that the 801 is an electric multiple unit, not an electro-diesel. The engine overpowers the motor sounds, and consequently ruins the immersion. If you can actually hear them, those initial motor whine sounds are accurate enough, but the obviously reused Class 377 running sounds kicked in at around 21 miles per hour. An IET is not supposed to sound like an Electrostar. Talk about a lack of respect for the source material. Especially given the comparatively good sounds on the Metrolink F125 and Hyundai Rotem cab cars, which is quite unusual for an American add-on in TSW. Come to think of it, if Dovetail could reuse 377 sounds for the 801, despite it not making any sense for that particular train, why the hell could they not do the same for the Talent 1 on S-Bahn Vorarlberg? It would have made some level of sense there, because the real Talent 1 sounds more like a 377 and nothing like a sodding Talent 2. Going back to the 801, another issue I noticed was that the door beeps are too quiet, and the movement is too fast. It's like the Class 172 and way too many other Dovetail products in TS Classic, and I will show you what I mean here. One thing I don't understand about the Hitachi IETs is why they only come as 5 or 9 car units. Even the new Class 810 for East Midlands Railway is only a 5 car unit. At most, you'll only ever get these things running in a 10 car formation, but that has to be made up of 2 5 car units coupled together, and in those cases you can't walk from one end of the train to the other due to the lack of cab end gangways. With the 9 car units, you can walk from one end of a long train right to the other, albeit with one less coach. Based on my first impressions of the Class 801 in TSW4, I thought that this train was nowhere near as good as the Class 700, probably because any reused sounds on the 700 were less obvious than those on the 801. Of course, rather than making a freight locomotive that we still don't have in TSW, or at least a new livery for the Class 66, Dovetail took the lazy approach and recycled the EWS Class 66 again. This means that some people will have effectively paid for the same locomotive in livery 5 times. Previously, we had the now overused 66 included with 3 routes, namely Great Western Express from London to Reading, East Coastway from Brighton to Eastbourne and Seaford, and the extended Southeastern High Speed. At least the GWE route includes a DB Schenker livery as well as the overused EWS one. And Dovetail, I am absolutely sick of you rehashing the same old 66 and never giving us any new UK freight locomotives. Something like a Class 60 Tug or Class 70 would be much appreciated, certainly a lot more so than another 66 rehash. But even then, just a GB Rail Freight or Freightliner reskin for the 66 would be fine. At least then it would add a bit more colour variation, and consequently make the routes look that little bit more interesting. It seems very strange that Dovetail would mention the Class 56 diesel locomotive in a pre-release article talking about Peterborough to Doncaster, only to not bother including the Class 56 in TSW. That is yet another missed opportunity, which I definitely don't find frustrating in the slightest. Dovetail also made a steam locomotive as an add-on for Peterborough to Doncaster, but why they couldn't just include her with the route like the 801 instead of selling her separately and locking her behind the deluxe edition paywall is anyone's guess. The locomotive in question is the coach smasher of Aviemore, otherwise known as the sole surviving LNER A3 Class 462 Pacific, number 60103 Flying Scotsman. I've always preferred how this engine looks in LNER Apple Green with the number 4472, instead of the same old overused British Railways Brunswick Green, which is seen on far too many locomotives in the preservation era. Oddly enough, there is a Matangi EMU in Wellington that has the same number as Flying Scotsman. I believe this part of the add-on was made to celebrate the locomotive's 100th anniversary, and so you can use this thing on rail tours between Peterborough and Doncaster, the latter being the city in which this locomotive was built. I suppose you could drive her on the Peak Forest route as well, since that route is set in the boring and overused British Railways era that Dovetail seems rigidly insistent on focusing on the rare occasions when they ever acknowledge the existence of steam locomotives. But this model of the A3 depicts her current instead of early 1960s condition. She also comes with a Mark I BG masquerading as a support coach, and some Mark II coaches to represent a modern-day rail tour consist, but these coaches are all just recycled from the existing Northern Trans-Pennine route, and the interiors are largely unchanged. Trust Dovetail to cut corners anywhere they can. They'll end up with a perfect circle at this rate, and they wonder why people are rapidly losing their will to support this rotten company. Scotsman's chuffing sounds are quite distinctive due to her 3-cylinder layout. There are 6 exhaust chuffs per wheel rotation instead of the usual 4. Given Dovetail's infamous incompetence and apparent contempt for their own customers, I was expecting them to royally mess up the Flying Scotsman with a realistic chuffing sound. James May would not be impressed, and I suspect that only a handful of you will get that reference. Unlike the other 3 steam locomotives currently in TSW, the preserved A3 is equipped with modern safety systems for mainline running. These include AWS, TPWS, although I can't figure out how to activate these bloody things, and even a GSMR module in a small cabinet on the tender, although the model is a non-functioning dummy in-game. The locomotive's tutorial is just as basic as the one for the EMD F125, because it only gives a very surface-level explanation on how to drive the locomotive, neglecting to go into any detail about how the signals or any advanced controls on the locomotive work. There is a voiceover and subtitles in the tutorial, with the former being provided by Matt Peddleston himself, but the recording is so quiet that you can barely hear him talk once the A3 is on the move. I was very annoyed at the mention of Australia in the history section, as it only highlights the glaring lack of Australian routes in TSW, although the only reason this country was mentioned at all is because Flying Scotsman actually visited Australia in 1988. An Aussie route is something that people have been asking for God knows how long at this point, and it's about bloody time we got a route from the land down under in TSW. My preferred Aussie route would either be the Ski Tube Rack Railway in New South Wales, a part of the 3-foot 6-inch gauge network in Tasmania, or the Frankston/Stony Point and Werribee/Williamstown commuter lines in Melbourne. If someone ever made the Ski Tube line, preferably as an official third-party release on Steam, I reckon I would buy it sight unseen because of the line's incredibly unusual nature. In timetable mode, you get 58 playable services for the 5-car Class 801/1, 96 for the 9-car Class 801/2, and only 12 for the A3 Pacific. With locomotives from other add-ons layered in, it makes the route a little bit more lively, but the rail scene in-game still leaves a lot to be desired. Although there are 23 playable services for the Class 700, these are largely pointless, as they are all just short empty stock moves from Peterborough station to the nearby sidings, ranging from a mere 3 to 7 minutes long. And another thing I noticed is that it seems like the unit is still playing the wrong motor sounds. When the 700s are running under the wires, they are not supposed to have that classic UFO sound that you associate with units like the Class 450. The playable services for the Class 158, of which there are 27, are a lot more reasonable than those for the 700. In this case, you're able to drive the 158 in passenger service between Grantham and Peterborough, and this is the East Midlands Class 158 that comes with the Midland Mainline, Leicester to Derby and Nottingham add-on. The Class 66 also has 27 playable services, although 2 of them are split into 2 parts. These freight services mostly run at night in order to reduce disruption for the passenger services. Assuming train operating companies in the UK ever care about providing a punctual service for their passengers. Besides the motive power with playable services, rolling stock from a few more add-ons will also appear on this route for AI-only services. One such unit is the Class 323 from the Glossop Line add-on, used to represent northern services from Doncaster to Leeds, even though 323s don't run to Doncaster in real life. Some of the 801's services are only drivable as far north or south as Grantham, because not all of them stop at Peterborough. Strangely, DTG included paths for Lumo and Grand Central services in timetable mode, but we do not get the Class 803 or Class 180 with this add-on. The lack of prototypical motive power doesn't help my already low opinion of this route, because it's very unrealistic to only see 801s over and over again. On the unexpected plus side, the stations don't look too bad, although that's probably because Dovetail would have thought that having less stations would mean that they would have more time to make sure each station had a good amount of detail. Speaking of which, I thought Doncaster had a healthy amount of detail and NPCs to make the platforms feel somewhat busy. I especially like the food details for the obvious subway clone, even though it's clearly just flat 2D textures. Unfortunately, you don't get any unique rolling stock to shunt into and out of the nearby workshops, let alone even a reskin for the Class 08. As research runs, if you will, I ran timetable mode services in both directions on this route with the Class 801. The first was 1N85, a London King's Cross to York service, departing Peterborough at 14:01, and taking 63 minutes to reach Doncaster, while calling at Grantham, Newark Northgate and Retford on the way. Throughout the run I only saw 18 AI trains, most of which were 801s, and for whatever reason, the schedule called for 3-minute waits at each station, which only made the journey even more boring. The second run was on 1A39, a Leeds to London King's Cross service. departing Doncaster at 16:17 and taking 43 minutes to reach Peterborough without stopping at any other stations. And on this run, I only saw another 18 AI trains again, and most of them were the same old 801s. I was using a pair of 5-car 801s on that second service, but the unit numbers are all broken. Every single 801 that spawns on this route in-game will display the unit number 801234, despite, in this case, clearly being 5-car 801-1s instead of 9-car 801-2s. I initially thought that this might have been because 1A39 was supposed to be operated by an 801-2 and accidentally spawned the 801-1s. But this particular service is not selectable from the list of 801-2 services, so this really is just a bug with the numbers. I also noticed that the taillights on the inner driving coaches were still on when they shouldn't be. Trust doesn't test games to not bother fixing these issues and instead leave it for the player to discover themselves. This is not how you do Easter eggs, guys. And we are paying customers, Dovetail, not beta testers. Oh, and when I got back to Peterborough, this absolute numpty got stuck in front of this shelter instead of moving off to one side and walking along the platform as normal. Something else that's worth mentioning is the inconsistent performance throughout the route. It is mostly fine, getting at least 75 frames per second, but the Peterborough and Doncaster areas are very laggy, dropping to around 30 or 35 FPS due to the excessive numbers of static rolling stock. Southeastern High Speed actually runs smoother than ECML Peterborough to Doncaster, despite SEHS being a larger route with a total length of 89 miles. The journeys between Peterborough and Doncaster with the Class 801s only proved just how boring this section of the East Coast Mainline really is. There really is no remarkable or noteworthy scenery/landmarks, and this route choice was so bad that it could rival the Antelope Valley line. What the hell are Dovetail playing at? Oh well, at least we've got another steam locomotive with which we can mess about, even though she's yet another locomotive in the goddamn BR colours.